Belgium. Well, before he could finish his thought, his wife, who had just come into the rooms, interrupted. She said, "Wait a minute, that's not how it happened. It happened when the Archduke was assassinated." Well, instantly, her husband scowled and snapped back, and he said, "Who's answering this question, me or you?" Well, with that, his wife turned on her heels, and in a huff, she went out and slammed the door. The dishes in the cabinet rattled. There was kind of an uneasy silence that hung in the air. And after a minute, Bobby said, "Dad, you don't have to explain to me anymore. I think I know now." You know, this fellow wasn't quite as smart as the old man in the village. And there's a couple of fellows in the village that got into a bad dispute. And so they came, the first man came to the wise man in the village, and he told his version of what the dispute between him and the other fellow in the village is all about. And the old sage listened very intently, nodded his head, and he said, "You know, you're absolutely right." Well, the next night, the second fellow came, and he told his side of the story. And the old man sat there, and he nodded his head and listened. And when he got done, he said, "You know what? You're absolutely right." Well, the second man left, and the sage's wife come in, and she scolded her husband. She said, "These two men have come the last 2 nights, and they've told you absolutely different stories, and you've agreed with both of them they're right." She said, "That's impossible. They can't both be right." The old man looked deep into his wife's eyes, and he nodded his head, and he said, "You know what, honey? You're right." Now, I tell these two stories to make the point that oftentimes there's elements of truth on both sides of an issue. Rarely in human conflict is one side all right and the other side all wrong. But what happens, we get into it and we begin to disagree with each other, and conflict arises, and then we got a problem. So tonight we want to take the entire lesson, and we've alluded to this a little bit in our study on anger last night, but we want to talk about how to deal with conflict, because I know this both from personal experience and from observation and from people coming to me over the years, that no matter how good a marriage you have, no matter how fine a Christian home that you have, that you're going to have conflict. There are going to be some times when you have disagreement, and we need to learn how to handle it. It's good to be with you again tonight. I appreciate the kind things that have been said to me about the lesson. In fact, last night I had a number of people go out and nod their head and say, "I needed that." And what they didn't realize, I probably needed as much as anybody. And so I recognize the practicality of these lessons, and I appreciate your encouragement, the kind of things you've had to say. And I appreciate the hospitality you've been extending to my wife and I. It is, I know during these COVID times, different, but you all have found a way around that. And I appreciate that in taking care of our needs this week. What we want to do this evening, basically, is look at 3 things. We want to look at the reason for conflict, and then how we may respond to conflict. And then we want to take the last part of the lesson and talk about how we can solve conflict. I want to suggest to you 3 reasons for conflict in our homes, and probably really in most of our relationships where we have conflict. And it first comes about because of selfish desires. In the book of James in chapter 1, James answers Bobby's question. What causes war? What causes fights and quarrels among you? And James says, don't you know they come from your desires that battle within you? And so the Bible is very clear, almost blunt, to remind us that our conflicts, our problems, our disagreements, even one version uses the word wars, the wars in your soul come about because of your lust or because of your desires for pleasure. Competing desires are always going to cause conflict. And you know, sometimes it's the little things in life that in our home lives cause conflict. And in one sense, they're not that big a deal. You know, someone made the comment about marriage one time, that marriage is two people, one person lying in bed that is too hot next to another person that's too cold. And that's kind of the way it is. Now, modern society has solved that conflict of the thermostat, certainly at least in the winter, because you can get an electric blanket with dual thermostats. And so if you got a conflict about how warm the bed should be, or blankets you should have on, you can get you one of those. But I've seen couples get in an argument, how do you fold towels? Now that's a big deal when they come out of the dryer, and you got, which way do you fold the towels, you see? Or some people don't fold them. Where we're staying, this lady has rolled them, and she's got in the bathroom all the washcloths and everything in a little basket, and they're all rolled up. Someone said that's the way that you do that. Or here's a better way. How about the toilet paper? Which way does the toilet paper go? Does it go next to the wall on the inside, or does it come out on the outside? And there's strong opinions. I've seen people getting big arguments on Facebook about the toilet paper. And people can get into all kinds of things like that. You know, some couples, one fellow quipped, are kind of like first down markers at a football game. They're chained together, but they're 10 yards apart. And that's what happens to us sometimes when we talk about the problems and the challenges of conflict. I mentioned the other night that we come into marriage with a lot of unspoken expectations. And we think this person is going to meet my needs. And therein begins to be the problem. Instead of us thinking about how can I meet the other person's needs, that we think about our needs and how our needs can be met. A fellow by the name of H. Page Williams writes a neat little book entitled, Do Yourself a Favor, Love Your Wife. And he tells one time of a wife that had come to him for counseling, and he asked the wife the question, what was her husband doing that caused her to want to leave him? And her reply was, nothing. And she went on to explain a little bit what it is. Williams says one of the reasons why men have lost the respect of their families is because they become spectators in the family situation. He said, I asked one little boy what his father did for a living, trying to learn what his occupation was. And the little boy replied, he watches. Oh, you mean he's a night watchman? Oh no, the little fella said, he just watches. Well, I asked, what does he watch? Well, I don't know if I can tell you everything, the boy said, but I can name a few things. He said, well, tell me. He said, well, he watches TV. And he watches mom do the housework. He watches for the paper boy. And he watches the weather. And he said with a rather impish grin on his face, and I think he watches girls too. He watches the stock market, football games, all the sports. He watches mother spank us. He watches us do our homework. He watches us leave and go to church and PTA and shopping. He watches my brother mow the lawn, and he watches me a lot. He watches my sister clean up the dirty dishes. He watches me wash the dog. He watches mom write letters. And he watches mom pay bills. But mainly, the little fella said with a note of sadness in his voice, he just watches. There's a selfish fella, unconcerned about the needs of his family, only his own needs, his own pleasure, his own satisfaction. So one reason for conflict is selfish desires. But another reason is a failure to follow the Spirit. If there is unrighteousness and ungodliness in our lives or that of other family members, then there are going to be conflicts. So the Apostle Paul would write in Galatians chapter 5, verses 16 and 17, I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary one to another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. Some time ago, my wife and I watched a movie, and it was based on the life of Ray Charles. And I don't know if you remember much about his life, but he had a lot of conflict in his life, and he had a lot of conflict in his marriage. And in the beginning of this, when they were having conflict, his wife didn't understand what was going on. And then later she learned he was using drugs. And then she learned that he was being unfaithful to her. Well, obviously those are two huge things. They're going to be a major source of conflict in a marriage relationship. But what it amounts to is a failure to follow the Spirit. And unfortunately, sometimes in Christian homes, we see husbands or wives or both that are not following what the Bible says. And this text in Galatians chapter 5, of course, lists some things. Lists some things that we might not be guilty of. You may not be guilty of adultery, or you may not be guilty of murder, may not be guilty of drunkenness. But there's a lot of attitudinal things there that have to do with envy and jealousy and selfishness that we may get caught up in. Idolatry, covetousness is idolatry. Idolatry may be one of them, as we idolize material things. And so as we are bent upon our own fleshly desires and fulfilling those desires, we can allow those to so preoccupy our thoughts and our feelings and actually the way we're living our lives, our actions, that is going to cause conflict in the marriage relationship and in the home. A third reason I would suggest for conflict is the problem of poor communication. Now, you may notice that I have found a way in other lessons to work this in and talk about communication. And I've done that on purpose because the problem of communication is one of the huge problems. I mean, any book that you read about relationships in the home, communication is going to come up as one of the chief issues and problems that people face. You know, it's kind of like this couple. I know you believe you understood what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. Some folks have a problem with communication, of being able to express their feelings and their thoughts. And then we have the problem of communication, as we talked about the other night from Ephesians 4:29, where Paul said, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace unto the hearers." And so there's two things there. On the one hand is the problem of corrupt communication, and this is a word that has to do with, means putrid or filthy. That is one kind of communication that's going to cause a problem, as opposed to communication that is upbuilding and edifying, that is going to impart grace. But poor communication is going to be a cause of conflict. Dr. Nick Stennett, along with his colleagues, did some research a number of years ago on trying to figure out what makes families strong. And they surveyed 3 families at the university where he was working at the time, and they published a research paper. Later, they expanded that research, and I think the first research group was like 300 families. They later expanded that as they continued the research to 1,000 families, and ultimately it went nationwide to over 10,000 families. Their research paper was finally put into a book, and Dr. Stennett said this: "Research shows that strong families have very good communication patterns. They avoid communication through rumor, and they talk directly. They also show deep respect by listening very carefully, and they keep their conflicts out in the open and talk about them until a solution is reached that is best for everybody." J.E. Adams, who's an author, lecturer, and a Christian counselor, wrote, "A sound husband-wife relationship is impossible apart from good communication. A healthy relationship between parents and children depends upon such communication." And then Dr. Paul Faulkner, who was a professor at ACU and co-founder of the Marriage Enrichment Seminar, in his book, What Every Family Needs, said, communication is to love what blood is to the body. When communication stops, love begins to die. And then Dr. David Mace, who has been a marriage counselor for many years, said that poor communication is the main problem in 86% of troubled marriages. You know, if you take the book of Proverbs, and we did this the other night when we were talking about the point of communication, all the different places the book of Proverbs talks about communication and about the way that we talk to each other. And the New Testament talking about having our words seasoned with salt and with grace, and to speak the truth in love. The Bible is just filled with advice to us about communication. And yet one of the reasons for conflict is because we fail at that. John Paul Richner in Cup of Chicken Soup for the Soul said, never part without loving words to think of during your absence. It may be that you will not meet again in this life. Well, let's talk for a little while about how we respond when conflict comes along. And I'm basically just going to kind of bullet these because I want to spend most of the time and talk about how we resolve conflict. But one way we resolved, and because we follow selfish desires, is it's got to be my way. That it's going to be my way or the highway. It's going to be my way or we're going to have a fight. And when we enter into any situation or challenge this way, there is going to be a fight. There's going to be a conflict. You're going to have a very unsatisfying relationship. Or it may be no way. That some people, when conflict comes, back off, and they don't want to face conflict. You remember the other night I was talking about the different personality types, and I talked about the phlegmatic. Very often I have found in talking with couples that if you have one that is a phlegmatic, they don't like to fight. They don't like conflict. They don't like problems. And so they just back off. And they will do anything to avoid an argument. They will ignore the problem. They will withdraw. But here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is still there. And while there may not be on the surface a lot of arguing because the phlegmatic doesn't want to fight, the problem, and especially with the other person, sees underneath emotionally. And really, even within the phlegmatic, the problem is still there. They just don't admit or talk about it. So no way doesn't work. Well, some think if I just do it your way. We face a conflict, we just say, have it your way. And it's the attitude of always giving in, and you just sort of roll over and play dead. Well, if you use this method of conflict, you're going to grow more and more bitter, and eventually you probably are going to explode and there's going to be a problem. Then there's halfway. Now, this goes like this, all right? You've got an idea and I've got an idea, and I tell you what, let's compromise. I win some of the time and you win some of the time, and we meet halfway. Now that's actually better than the other three. And sometimes you hear people talk about marriage, and have you ever heard someone say, well, marriage is a 50-50 proposition? Several years ago I clipped out an article, and somehow I didn't get the name of the author on here. I don't know why. But at any rate, they talk about this issue of a 50-50 marriage. And they write, as nice as it sounds on paper, there's one big problem with it. It's a lie. It doesn't work. Not in real life anyways. It's not, and not if you want to stay married. In a 50-50 marriage, both spouses will give equally, right? Well, how would you decide what counts as equal? How many hours of child care equals, and how many hours of paying the bills? And what about all the things you do every day that the other one never sees? Keeping points on paper would be a nightmare, and keeping your points in your head leads to anger, bitterness, and resentment. And even if you could somehow reach a magical 50-50 balance, what happens when one spouse genuinely can't carry their half of the load, either for a time or indefinitely? You or your spouse may get sick, get pregnant, become disabled, suffer depression, or develop Alzheimer's disease, leaving all or the majority of the burden on the other spouse. What then? Plus, the author says, keeping score is just petty. Shouldn't you love, serve, and take care of your family because you love them and not somehow because they've earned it and because they did enough in return? He says, I know you want to help and there's nothing wrong with that and you should have to help. But if you are, you're focusing on the wrong thing. He says, if you're married, you very likely said vows on your wedding day, and the vows went something like this. I take you for my lawful wedded wife or husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for richer or for poorer, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. And the point is made that for better or for worse, and richer and poorer, in sickness and health, until death do us part, is not based on a 50-50 proposition. See, what you really need to give is 100%, 100%. And when both the husband and the wife are given 100%, then you minimize the problem of conflicts. And so how we should really respond is God's way. I recognize you have needs and I want to meet those needs. And you recognize that I have needs and you want to meet those needs. And so instead of half and half, we put everything we got in it. We're all familiar with Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord. Men love that verse. But you know the verse right before that, verse 21 says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. I believe that's in the context of everything he says all the way down through chapter 5 and even into chapter 6. And so when there is a mutual submission, now not in terms of authority, I understand that he goes on to say the husband is the head of the wife, and God placed man in the role of leadership and headship. I'm not talking about submission in terms of authority, but I'm talking about submission in terms of meeting needs, in terms of serving one another. And when we submit to one another, and we do it, not because we're going to get something out of it, but here he gives the motivation out of reverence for Christ. Because you belong to Christ and I belong to Christ, and both of us are trying to serve Christ, then we submit and we serve the needs of one another. Well, that leads us then to how to resolve conflicts, because I've already said it, and you know from your own experience, that conflicts do arise even in the best of homes and with the best of intentions. And so we need to stop and to look at some biblical steps that can help us resolve our conflicts. You know, sometimes when people have a conflict, it's almost like a war zone for some people. And then for other couples, it's more like a stage where you're actors and you're playing the same parts over and over again. And then for other couples, their conflicts are more like a courtroom where each is an attorney or prosecuting attorney that's stating their case. So what I suggest is that we lay down our weapons and we take off our mask and we lay aside our legalities and we work at developing a relationship and defining a new way to deal with conflict. And the first place to begin is to be a believer. Commit to Christ. Now, sometimes when I'm presenting a series like this, or even counseling with couples, I'm dealing with a situation where one's not a Christian. And I would, quite frankly, tell the person that's not a Christian that you need to be a Christian. And when I have counseling opportunities, I study with the mate that's not to try to help them become a Christian. And certainly I want to make the point that from a standpoint of salvation, they ought to be a Christian. But the serendipity of that is you're going to have a better home. You have a better chance for a stronger marriage and a better home when you're a believer. Now, again, I understand that you don't do that. You don't become a Christian just to make your home better. You do it because you're a sinner and Christ died for you and you need to be a Christian. I understand that. But I'm saying your home is going to be better when both are believers. But I put on there, instead of become a believer, is to be a believer. Now, look at this. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. If you're here tonight as a Christian or watching at home, and by the way, I sincerely hope we've had a lot of people that are online watching this at home, but whoever you are, wherever you may be listening to this and watching this, if you're a Christian, but you're not really living right, you need to get right. You need to be a believer, you need to become a believer, and you need to be a believer. You need to resolve any conflict you have with God, and in doing so, live as a faithful Christian, and then act like a faithful Christian. And then the second thing I would suggest is to talk to God about the problems. I'm amazed at how many times that people have come to me with a conflict and trying to want me to help solve it. And I ask, have you prayed about it? And the answer is no. And you've had a conflict and you've never prayed about this problem? Philippians 4:6 says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And so when we deal with problems and challenges and disagreements and arguments and conflicts, one of the first things that we need to think about doing is praying about that. Praying for each other, praying for our attitudes, praying for wisdom, praying for direction, praying for insight, praying that we can solve this in the right way. We need to pray about it. Don't worry. Don't wring your hands. Don't be anxious. But he says pray, and pray with supplication. I mean, that's like an intense prayer, you see. That's like extreme prayer. That's begging prayer. And let your requests be made known to God. You see, if we've got a problem in our relationship, and how many times have we looked at this verse the past few nights, 1 Peter 3:7, but we've been talking earlier about dwelling with our wives according to understanding or understandingly. But the last part of that talks about that when our relationship is not what it ought to be, then our prayers have the possibility of being hindered. And so we need to solve our conflicts and resolve our problems, because if we don't do that, then we have a challenge of our prayers being hindered and God not hearing our prayers. So we begin by being a believer, then talking to God. And the third thing is learn to change your focus. What are you focusing on? J.E. Adams says that when two people come in, he says they're usually pointing at each other. And in his fine little book, Christian Living in a Home, Adams says that he wants to get the arrows pointing in the same direction. In other words, and I've always seen this, and I'm sure Adam has had counseling situations come in, they're pointing at each other. You. And so Adam says, you get the fingers pointing the same way. Now, how do you do that? Well, man, you won't like Adam's suggestion. But what J.E. Adams says is, since you're the head of the house, point the finger at yourself. Now both the fingers are pointing the same way. She's already pointing at you. Now you're pointing at yourself. What he says is, admit where you're wrong. Admit, even if you think she's almost 100% wrong, there's got to be something that you can admit that you're wrong about. And so point the finger at yourself. And that begins to lessen the conflict and the problem. Change your focus. Sometimes our focus is looking at the worst side of everything, or we're magnifying minor things or the minority of the problems that may arise in marriage. Faulkner and Burkeen, in their book on marriage and family, said this: a marriage that is 85% positive but only 15% negative will appear 90% bad if the couple spends 90% of its time arguing over 15% of the problem areas. Did you get all those percentages? In other words, he says, never spend more time on a problem area than it deserves, nor allow minor differences to dominate too much time. Then he says this, maximize the positive and minimize the negative. Or as one writer said, define what is important and stress it, and define what is unimportant and ignore it. And so that'll go a long way as we change our focus. Book of Philippians talks about what we're focused on. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also of the interest of others. Well, that'll get the fingers pointing in the same direction, won't it? That if we're not so concerned about our own interest, but that we're looking out for the interest of our husband or our wife. Take the focus off of selfish needs. Think about what does my mate need and want and desire and require. How can I fulfill that? And then look upon the things of Christ. Well, the fourth thing I would suggest is establish ground rules. Now, in Ephesians 4:31, we've noticed in the past, he says, let bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. So, instead of being mean, be kind. Instead of being bad-tempered, be patient. Instead of being angry, try honesty and love. Instead of harsh words, use gentle words. Then in the next verse, in verse 32, he says to be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I recognize that this verse, this text, is written to the church at Ephesus, and that we typically take these passages and talk about our relationship as brethren. But is this verse in a vacuum that doesn't apply to our Christian life and our home? I think not. What if we took those two verses and applied that in our relationship between husbands and wives and parents and children? And so we got rid of the negative side there, the bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking, and the malice. And then we were kind, and we were tenderhearted, and we were forgiving, and we stopped to think, God's forgiven me. And through Jesus Christ, my sins have been forgiven. Can I forgive my son or my daughter? My husband, my wife, my father, my mother? That's how you resolve conflict. And then, even though Paul is talking to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:22, I suppose about brethren that may bring up things, I think, again, this is pretty good advice. Avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they engender strife. Now, I'm liable to get into trouble here, but I think if you're arguing over which way to put the toilet paper, that's a foolish and ignorant dispute. But I'm amazed of those kinds of things that husbands and wives will get into fusses about. Avoid things that's going to engender strife. H. Norman Wright, in his book on marriage, offers some ground rules, and so these are straight out of Wright's books, and I may have to explain one of them here. But one, he says, don't avoid conflict with a silent treatment. And we've talked about that a little bit already, clamming up and holding everything in. Don't avoid conflict that way. And then Wright uses the expression, don't save emotional trading stamps. Now, I'm old enough to know what he meant by that. I'm looking around, I see a few of you that are old enough to remember trading stamps. Anna may be too young to remember trading stamps. When I was a little boy, my mom used to get these stamps at the grocery store and maybe the gas stations, I can't remember where they gave them, green stamps. And she'd get these stamps, and in fact, you had to lick them back then. They had to peel off. Lick them, and she'd put them in books. And then she'd get a book full of these stamps, and they had a redemption store where you could trade them in for something. Anybody remember trading stamps? See, it's everybody with gray hair remembers the trading stamps. No one else knows what in the world I'm talking about. But Wright, obviously, when he wrote the book, as talking about it earlier time, but emotional trading stamp. So it's like someone that emotionally, you see, they're storing things up. They're remembering things that is happening in the relationship, and at the right time, they're going to trade the book in because of all the things that have happened in the relationship. You know, in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul said that love doesn't keep a record of wrongs. And if you're saving up emotional trading stamps, or to put it another way, a record, if you're saving all of your emails of all the bad things, or writing in your journal, you know, a lot of people journal. Nothing wrong with that. There's some good things. But I've known of people that will write the bad things about their spouse in their journal and then go back to the journal to read all these bad things. That's keeping a record of wrongs. Don't do that. Don't keep that sort of thing. And if possible, when you have conflict, prepare the setting. And so Wright suggests this. If you get children, get a babysitter for the kids. Parents, let me tell you something. One of the worst things you can do to your children is get in a big argument and a knockdown, drag-out fuss in front of your kids. I mean, there's just not anything worse. And so, one thing, you might take it to the bedroom, but you know what my wife and I kind of learned about kids at a certain age? Open the bedroom door real quick and see what happens. You know, there they are. So, you got a big conflict that you're dealing with. It's not something that you just solve real easy. Get a babysitter for the kids. Go to the park and sit there in a nice park-like setting on a bench and talk and hold hands while you're doing that, okay? Or go to a nice restaurant and order a meal and sit there and talk. You say, well, I don't want to go to a restaurant and get in a big fuss. Well, you won't, probably. Get in a big fuss at a restaurant, you'll talk calmly because you don't want to embarrass yourself in front of other people. See? Or probably even at the park. You'll do that, especially if you're sitting there holding hands. Now, don't be like the couple my wife and I saw. We were walking through the park one day, and they're sitting there holding hands, young couple, and that's sweet. And then I looked closer, and each of them had a cell phone in the other hand looking the other way. You know, well, that's not going to do you good. Go and hold hands, turn your cell phones off, and talk. Talk this thing out and get it solved. That's what he means, prepare the setting. Attack the problem and not the person, not each other. Too often times we attack one another. You know, one of the sad things in the political polarization that we've been experiencing in our country, and even more during this election cycle, are the personal attacks that we hear on other people. Well, that doesn't solve anything. That doesn't help us know more about policy or how problems are going to be solved. But the same thing is true to marriage. That making fun of the other person, attacking the other person, demeaning them, making fun of their upbringing or their mother or whatever, none of that is going to solve the problem. Attack the problem and not the person. Stay on the subject. So you got a problem, then take that one problem, work on it. But see what happens a lot of times, then we get in a big fuss and you jump from subject to subject to subject of all these things you've been storing up, your emotional trading stamps, and they all come out. And nothing ever gets solved. Stay on the subject. Don't throw your feelings at your mate. That's a metaphor. In other words, instead of throwing dishes, you're just throwing your feelings, hurling your feelings in an ugly way. Don't do that. And then offer solutions with criticisms. Well, I don't know what Wright's religious background is, but that right there was worth the price of the book. That's some pretty good advice on how to establish ground rules and resolve conflict. And then go and make peace. Jesus says, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift before the altar and go your way, and first be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Suppose there we substitute your brother and we put your husband, or we put your wife, or we put your parents, or we put your son or your daughter. I think the same principle there applies. Conflict is not resolved accidentally. It has to be deliberate. And you don't go to try to resolve this and make excuses. You choose the right time and the right place and the right way, and you go with the idea of making peace. The last thing I would share on how to resolve conflict is to ask advice. If you're stuck in a rut and don't know how to get out, get some help. Ask advice. The one piece of advice that I gave both our son and daughter when they got married was that when you've got a problem, get some help. And don't let it simmer. Don't let it go on. I cannot believe the number of times that I've had people come to me, and it might be a husband-wife problem, it might be a parent-child problem, and they will come to me with the problem, and I will always ask them, how long has this been going on? I've had people tell me 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Well, I will ask, who have you gone to get advice? Nobody. Well, you've been to counseling, right? No. Well, you've talked to one of the elders? No. Well, the preacher that was here before me? No. Can you imagine you got a problem 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and you're just now asking for advice? Most of the time, people, I will try if I can to offer a little advice, but almost always people let it go that long. You know what they need? They need professional help. They have got a problem that is so complex and that is so knotted up with so many different issues. You got to go to someone that has got a master's degree or a PhD degree in counseling to unravel that, and it's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks to figure some of that out. Now, I'm just telling you that's what I've observed. Get advice. Pride only breeds quarrels, but wisdom is found in those who take advice. Now, we do that in everything else in life. Your tooth begins to hurt a little bit. Well, what do you do about it? You don't ignore it. Now, you might for a little while, but you won't for long. And you don't talk to your buddy at work about it. You go to a dentist and they x-ray it. They say, you got a bad cavity. You need a filling, or that tooth needs to come out. You need a root canal. Boy, I love to hear that. You need to have a root canal and then a crown put on there. But you go to an expert. We were coming back from our trip in Montana back in August, and Norma says, what's that noise the car's making? I said, I don't know. I just began to notice that. I said, do you think it's the road we're on that's causing road noise? It didn't sound like it, but of course then we changed the highway after a while, and it still made it. I said, I don't know what that is. Well, when we got back down to Florida, I sought me out a real good mechanic. Yelp said he was 4.7 out of 5. And so I thought, well, I'll trust this guy. Never been there before. That's the way I approach it. And went in, and I said, I told him what it was doing. And he said, well, I don't have time to fix it today. I said, well, would you mind? I said, I know if you hear this, you probably know. I don't know what it is, but you'll probably know. Would you just take a moment to drive my car and then get to it when you can? He got in it. In less than 60 seconds, maybe 30 seconds, he said, your wheel bearing has gone out. And he not only said my wheel bearing, he said it's your right-left wheel bearing. That guy's an expert. Guess what? He was exactly right. Got it in a couple of days. He repaired it. No, he's gone. So you get advice. You go to people who can tell you. There are people that have spent their life in studying relationships. And they're experts. Now, let me just give you this word of advice. Be careful who you go to for advice. Because there's a lot of counselors out there that are going to counsel you with humanistic philosophy. And we talked about that a little bit Sunday, didn't we, about the problem of humanism. They're going to give you humanistic advice. One place I was, one of the deacons, he and his wife were having problems. And he went to the counselor at work. They had some counseling deal there, I guess. And you know what the counselor at work told him? The counselor said, you need a change. Yeah, you need a new wife. That was that counselor saying. Well, no, you don't want to go to a counselor like that. You want to go to someone that's going to counsel you on a biblical-based value system. Ask for advice. Well, you all sure have listened well tonight. And I believe that these things will help you in improving your relationship in your marriage and in your home. Conflict is inevitable. Problems are going to arise. We're going to face challenges, that you can solve them. I want to close with just a few lines from a poet. And I'm not sure who the author is. I've seen some different accounts who it might be, but usually it says unknown. And I think it applies to our relationship as Christians in the home. It's entitled, Don't Quit. When things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when the funds are low and the debts are high, when you want to smile, but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but don't you quit. Don't quit. Don't give up. Don't give in. And don't give out. You can solve conflict. So tonight we close with a song of invitation, encouragement, Footprints of Jesus. It could be here that you owe a duty to God in some way, and you've heard Adam or others preach on what to do to become a child of God. And you would do that this evening. Maybe there are things in your life that you need the prayers of the brethren here. If we can serve you in any way, we invite you to come as we stand and while we sing.